Okay, so with this session, what I want to look at is this idea, masculinities, and where they intersect with harm uh, in my gym's research. So exploring some of the issues relating to harm which have come up and tying that in with masculinities and perceptions of masculinity and kind of the influences these have had on a broader cultural level and in specific subcultures. So just to give an outline of the session, this is going to be findings from my research into gym cultures, which is based on an ethnography where I spent several years involved in going into different gym environments, in talking to people about steroid use and about their participation in gym culture more broadly, and trying to get an understanding, get a feeling for actually why are people engaging in gym training, how does this tie in with kind of their broader beliefs, their broader ideals and conceptions of masculinity and so forth, and how does this inform steroid use and consequently potential for harm and risk. So harm is going to be sort of the overarching theme of this presentation and the thing that I keep coming back to, but that's very much going to be grounded in looking at trends in gym cultures and how these are kind of informed by masculinities and in particular conceptions of masculinity. So that's kind of the broad context that you need in advance of the presentation. And I've just included a note at the bottom that actually a lot of the things that I discuss, I'm going to be focusing on masculinity, and I'm going to be focusing on attempts to embody an idealized conception of masculinity. What you'll realize, of course, is that a lot of these themes could similarly be applied to women who are, very much subject to gendered expectations in terms of gym training and in terms of broader exposure in media and social media and so forth. So it could well be that as I'm talking about certain aspects to masculinity and how this intersects with harms, you can think of sort of parallels which would be interesting to apply in the case of women's experiences. So with that note out the way, I am going to be focusing on men in this presentation, but hopefully you'll find it interesting. So let's begin by thinking about gym training very much about embodying certain ideals, and whether that's primarily focused on being very strong and very powerful, or whether it's focused on having a certain appearance and body image. Either way, we can tie this in with sort of ideas of bodily competency and how this intersects with masculinity. So historically, what was the value of having a muscular body? It was, of course, tied to work, ideas that you could label in a field far longer. You could do a lot more manual work. These sorts of ideas. So very much this idea that the muscular body or the strong body was serving a purpose, was serving a functional purpose beyond simply what you were able to show off. Essentially, it was representative of something. So although they're, in the case of height requirements for the police, for military and so on, that might be primarily focused on image. You can think of the King of Prussia, Bismarck. He obviously had a requirement that all the men who were guarding him be over a certain height, because it was supposed to represent this image of power. But we didn't necessarily explicitly see a drive towards wanting to look a certain way. It was just this idea that actually certain appearance did correlate with ideas of either performance or represented an image that portrayed something, some kind of functional use. Now that's kind of important context to keep in mind as we look at how time changes. But actually, it's also worth bringing up that there's simultaneous, kind of prior to actually trends in image for image's sake, and in status specifically linked to just looking a certain way, that actually there was already this growing trend of concern over can we have the rejuvenating use of certain hormones to actually increase our well-being and performance. And this happens in the 19th century, and Hoberman has all kinds of examples in his book of people who eat animal testicles, or drink these specific remedies and tonics to try and have this rejuvenating hormonal effect. So this idea that in some way there's some kind of essence of masculinity that you could imbibe, and that would make you more of a man in some way, which I'm going to return to a bit later in this presentation with perhaps a contemporary example of that, although I am going to critique whether it quite falls in line with those ways of thinking. But in the 20th century, we moved more towards these sorts of spectacles and idea of image, perhaps more explicitly having meaning. So initially, we have this traveling strongmen who go around, do these circus shows, and they're these big, very powerful guys who perform these feats of strength for entertainment. And Eugene Sandow is kind of the prime example of this. He's kind of considered the grandfather of modern bodybuilding, in that he was one of these circus strongmen, but rather than just be big overall and be quite fat, he had what we would think of as the more classic bodybuilder type physique that you see perhaps Charles Atlas, that I've used on this slide, has. So rather than be just big overall, this was a man who was muscular but without a lot of body fat, and this sort of garnered public interest in this physique type and the type of individual involved in these feats. And similarly, the catch as catch can wrestlers, this was really big. You had the Snake Pit in Wigan, very, very popular form of entertainment. Go and watch the wrestling, and similarly advertise these very big, powerful men. So we start to see this trend towards actually an ideal of masculinity coming about early in the 20th century that's very much beginning to be more focused on the particular physique and having a particular body image. And this starts to accelerate through the 20th century. So I've linked that we see advertising targeting women, making claims such as no man wants a fat woman, and therefore you have to take our special remedy to be in good shape. That was 1909, I think, the Marmola adverts. So there's some pressure on body image relating to gendered ideals now being targeted at women in the form of advertising. And we see this being targeted towards men with things like this Charles Atlas program, where it says, don't be half a man. You have to buy his program so you can get in shape and be like him, so that you're no longer, as you can see, it says how I changed from a mouse to a man. You're not a real man unless you're big and muscular. And this almost can be seen as the start of the trend. Now, keep that image of Charles Atlas in your head as I click to the next slide. So Charles Atlas, bodybuilder, this is advertised world impressive physique, and this is a scaffolder who went on Love Island, right? So something has changed in the interim, some interesting development, this growing obsession almost with body image and size as being a symbol of masculinity, and how that has encouraged a lot of men in the culture to actually participate in this training. So Harrison Pope and his colleagues talk about this in regard to developments in the late 20th century. Talks about the rise of action heroes like Arnold Schwarzenegger on movie screens. Talks about how dolls for boys like the G.I. Joe or the Action Man went from being quite normal looking proportion guys to being these big monster steroid looking freaks, basically. And there's some interesting clips of that you can find on YouTube if you just look up Harrison Pope. But there's been this kind of increasing obsession with the real man is this big, muscular, ripped man, and in kids' cartoons and things really targeted at young boys. So it's interesting to see the kind of development of this image as symbolic of masculinity. And I'm sure you can think of all kinds of things, like He-Man would be a good example of that. Now, this kind of coincides with actually broader economic changes that has been termed like the crisis in masculinity has been used. And we'll touch on this in relation to the gym and how it compares to traditional work. But actually, this idea that men were no longer getting the feeling of masculine identity through their work, with the decline in industrial work, decline of men being primary breadwinners, and so on. The values which men traditionally got their feeling of masculinity from declined. So whether image and muscles has become a kind of substitute for that and is now kind of the defining feature of masculinity is interesting to kind of explore. And of course, this can all be grounded within broader analyses of actually the changes under globalization and the increasing importance of the reflexive self. So we've seen this change. We've seen this kind of shift towards now muscle being the token of masculinity and what's represented in media. And it's interesting to see that, we had Arnold Schwarzenegger was this big hero, but he was supposed to be a larger than life character in these movies, versus when we're watching Love Island, it's I mean, I'll be honest, I've never watched Love Island, but I've seen the images and I've heard people discuss it. So I get the feeling that it's not represented as necessarily, this is clearly a guy who's on a lot of steroids and so on and so forth. This is becoming more what people perceive reality to be. And I'm sure that the women in the class, because of course it's class is more towards the female side. I'm sure that you guys have similar thoughts on actually the women's bodies and representation of women in those types of show, but it's very popular shows. So Brandon's just commented this guy is Natty. 100%. I don't know why I would suggest that guy was on steroids at all. He looks 100% natural, definitely. So does this next one. So along with those kind of shifts in what we've seen in media and so forth, there's actually been this real rise in gym cultures, and Hakeem talks about the fitness economy and actually the massive growth that we've seen coming into the 21st century. And this can be linked to all kinds of trends. It can be linked to ideas of wellness and evidencing that. And as I said, the reflexive self, there's a lot of different theoretical perspectives that you can kind of draw together to understand this rise, beyond this focus on perhaps purely on masculinity, because obviously women's participation has greatly increased as well. But this is still one element that I think is really interesting to explore in depth. So there's been this big rise in gym memberships and this rise in this growing social media culture, what's often termed aesthetics culture, where there's a lot of social status to be gained from putting up these images, representing yourself as participating in gym culture, and a lot of these images perhaps go beyond what people could achieve naturally, and we see the use of steroids very much involved in determining who's popular, are those who kind of go beyond what is achievable for the ordinary person. So you might recognize the Daily Mail font on this, but don't be fooled. This actually is an article by two very established academics in this field, Kyle Mulrooney, who actually was one of the reviewers on my book. Shout out to Kyle. Really appreciate that review he wrote for me. And Katinka van der Ven, who is she's the editor-in-chief of Performance Enhancement and Health, one of the journals in this field. So yes, that is, I did take that from the Daily Mail, but that's actually a reproduction of proper academic research. So they talk about this idea of the rise of the steroid selfie, that actually there's been social media seems to have exacerbated the trends that I was noting and that Harrison Pope talks about. And now in the age of social media, where we're connected to people all over the globe, there's a lot more opportunity for this social comparison. And it basically exacerbates these effects where there's more kind of perception that you need to be big in order to get the status, in order to fit in. And of course, there's some other things that go into that, but I think that's very interesting context for understanding what I'm going to cover regarding harm. So think about steroids and harm. Um, there's been a documented rise. Now it's hard with these things to know what percentage is an actual rise in use versus what is people are more willing to admit to use now because it's becoming a bit more normalized and things like that. But the figures do seem to suggest that there has been quite a sharp increase in steroid use, and certainly kind of prevalence of people admitting to use is a lot higher than it was. So while steroids historically were kind of understood as the preserve of elite athletes, or at least people engaging in sporting competition or involved in these kind of hardcore lifting subcultures like competitive bodybuilders and so forth, actually now the vast majority of people who are saying they're using steroids are saying they're using them for the purposes of looking better, and that's tying in with these kind of trends in social media and so forth. So because of this, there's actually been a call from some researchers that we need to start treating the use of steroids as a public health issue, because there's actually quite a few potentials for harm that come with the use of steroids. And some of these are linked to injection practices, whether people are, carrying out sterile injections, whether they know how to inject properly, whether there's any risk of virus spread, and that kind of thing. But there's also the longer term harms of what impacts can it have on your heart, on your liver, on your fertility, things like that. So a lot of things that perhaps need to be explored in the context of an apparent rise in use linked to these ideals of actually what should the contemporary man be. So one area that I want to explore is going to be trying to figure out the intersection between masculinities and the use of steroids and how this correlates to harm. And I will just quickly say because Brandon's put something in the chat, I am going to touch on TRT a little bit later in the presentation, so I will definitely get to that. But yeah, those types of figures, absolutely. Somebody like Rogan, where he talks about his use of steroids and has millions of subscribers, definitely that's worth keeping in mind as well. So one interesting way of exploring this is actually to look at how subcultures that you see in the gym and the people that I talked to during my ethnography, how their conceptions of masculinity and their kind of ideals inform their use of steroids. So one way I did this was kind of make a comparison between those who historically their cultures had been using, so primarily powerlifters, those who are involved in a competitive sport where steroid use is quite normalized, because it's one of the few sports where they don't drug test and it's accepted, or don't drug test in some federations. There are some tested ones. And compare this to kind of this modern trend of aesthetics culture and kind of what's termed lad culture as well, which very much the same social media oriented type of culture, but also involved more in sort of partying and more explicitly focused on sexual status. Whereas for aesthetics culture, the sexual side of it is just that links to the social capital and status that you get online. But these are kind of worth exploring and comparing to powerlifters to kind of understand how conceptions of masculinity in different subcultures might tie in with their steroid use and consequently harms. So talking to Pete, he was a trainee personal trainer. He is actually a full personal trainer now, as far as I know. And he was talking about his friends. He was from a group of lads who were very much involved in training, and he was explaining why they all use steroids. And he was saying the reason that they're all on is somewhere in Ibiza's coming in it. So that's the goal, really. We're only going for one reason. Do you know what I mean? So this idea that there's this kind of sexual status linked to having this muscular and ripped physique, and that actually they're very much driven by the reaction that they can get being able to show off and kind of be involved in this type of peacocking, and that motivates the steroid use in the run up to summer in Ibiza. And there were some interesting comments from him about, they're not using other times of the year and they go off and then they have to gain the mass back and things like that. But also it was tied in with social media and this suggestion that we have this new age fitness trend that everyone wants a quick path now, and he says my friends do anything to get likes. And what's interesting is this interview was in 2016, and if anything, it seems to be even more prevalent now on social media. This kind of growth of actually people posing and having to show off their bodies as kind of a means of getting online status. So there's kind of these two intersecting portions of their goals. And you can see the first kind of ties in with perhaps a stereotype of masculinity. And Pete did use this term, and you see this term posted in these online spaces of the alpha male. There's a lot of this kind of discussion going on. It's all about being the alpha male, being the biggest guy in the club and things like that. So it's quite interesting the language that's used and how that identifies a particular conception of masculinity. But also the kind of doing it for social status and popularity. And perhaps you could tease apart some of the contradictions actually in the wanting to look good as a symbol of masculinity when perhaps historically that was considered more of a feminine trait. So there's probably some interesting things that you can tease apart in relation to the kind of gendered connotations of these performances. But certainly a lot of the language that's used around this subculture really identifies it as being based on social comparison and sort of exaggerated ideals of masculinity and what it means to be a man, and how you have to get all the girls, and you have to have this body, and you have to engage in these practices and so on. And on the social media side, I've linked this actually to this rise in things like there's these sponsored athletes, there's these certain brands that you have to wear, and all kinds of things that very much actually this is part of your status signaling is I wear the right brands as well, and I've got the sponsorships and things like that. So it's somewhat interesting to compare this culture and these trends to actually those historic subcultures that were involved in steroid use in these kind of hardcore gym spaces that were a bit more established, and when there's more of these norms regulating the use of the drugs and these behaviors. So the main one I looked at was Powerlifters, and they have more of a kind of orthodox conception of masculinity in that they're more interested in their performance is about their strength and their functional ability to succeed in competition, as opposed to the summer in Ibiza and the social media posting necessarily. Although a lot of them now with contemporary changes are posting on social media, it's just different content. It's them lifting big weights, but obviously fulfilling that same purpose of showing off their masculine capital, but in a slightly different way to more explicitly showing off your body and showing you have the desirable physique. So it was interesting listening to powerlifters discuss their beliefs around steroids and their approach to the use of steroids. And actually, a lot of them would talk about making sure they had invested enough time in the sport before they moved on to using steroids, reached a certain level. And when they would talk about steroids, clearly they had conducted a lot of research, and they broadly had quite a good understanding of different nuances to the use of steroids. And they often condemned those who didn't follow these sort of approved norms for how you're supposed to use. So I got this example on the slide of Mariusz complaining about people in the gym who he says they're stupid and they're just trying to fill the fucking syringe for no reason. They don't understand how to use steroids properly, so they just use way more than they need to because they think that'll get them quick results. And this was quite common rhetoric from the powerlifters. So it's interesting that we have these sportsmen who are focused on kind of long-term use because they want to be competitive. And part of that might be showing off masculine capital within the confines or the framing of your subculture. But comparing that to actually the more showy masculinities where guys were training because they wanted to look really good on the beach in summer and they wanted to post a lot of pictures of themselves. Actually, when Pete, who was a bit more cautious and a bit more informed than his friends, he was talking about the rest of this kind of group of lads, and he was just saying they got no issue putting stuff into their body. He said they would take pills like they were Smarties, and they would, just whatever steroids they could get their hands on, they were all kind of sharing that. And I had a few other responses which kind of reflected that. So not just his friendship group, but this group more broadly, a bit more willing to take steroids without doing as much research and using sort of a bit more liberally. So Christensen et al. And Zano et al. As another paper. There's been a couple of academic publications which have looked at these different types of steroid user, come up with this typology, and kind of look at the expert users, those who are very informed, those who do a lot of reading and research, versus what's called YOLO trainers, which if we go back about 7 years, YOLO was a thing that was being said a lot, right? That you only live once, and justifying, living a bit in a bit of a wild manner. And so those trainers who fit more into this, the kind of more aesthetic side, the more social media conscious side, and the lads, it's kind of interesting how their ideals of masculinity, their motivations for training, actually intersect with harm, because it determines how they approach the use of steroids. So think about these harms. What kind of harms did I see in my research? So I've got some quotes on this slide which are interesting just to illustrate some of the harms experienced, but there were more. There were people having negative experiences when injecting and that sort of thing. But I think these quotes are quite good at illustrating some of the issues experienced. So this top one, this is still Pete, who I got a lot of good data from. We had a very long interview, but he says, 2 years ago, my mate had a heart attack on a night out. We all say, taking this many enhancers, this many fat burners, your heart rate will be all over the place. He has to go to the doctors every month just to get his heart rate monitored to make sure it's all right. And, this guy, he's had a heart attack, clearly some kind of underlying condition, but he's still going on these nights out. He's still taking these drugs. He's still using the steroids, still using the fat burners. So important to kind of contextualize. I think if you took a lot of those more traditional type users, if they had a heart attack, they might take that as, indicative of I need to rethink things, but very much building on this YOLO attitude and this idea, I'm going to die sooner or later, which was another quote that Pete actually highlighted in our interview. One of his friends saying, well, I'm going to die sooner or later, might as well do what I can now. Very much important to contextualizing kind of some of the harms that we're actually seeing in these cultures. And there's been broader things, looking internationally. Z's very famous sort of amateur bodybuilder, one of the original guys in aesthetics culture, when that started to take off, he died at 22 of heart failure. Now, maybe that was because of just underlying genetic condition, but the use of steroids and other drugs probably didn't help that. And there's been a few different cases of that kind. So talking about this kind of difference and these levels of harms, Big Steve, who was like an old school bodybuilder, he was in his 50s, I think he was late 50s, and he was talking and saying the problem that he notices training in more of a commercial type gym where there is more of a range of trainers. He says these young guys, they don't know how to do it properly. I know guys who are on 1,000 milligrams of test a day, and he's saying that's a crazy amount. When he was a competitive bodybuilder, there would be guys who were taking 250 a day, and he thought that was crazy at the time, and that was an absurd amount to be taking. And now he's saying just like lads in the gym are using more than what those competitive bodybuilders were using. So interesting. And to be honest, he didn't explicitly say in the interview that he was selling it to them, but he is a lot of people know him to be a supplier in the gym. So I think that's quite an accurate representation of the amounts that are being bought, certainly. And then the final element is actually, without so much focus on the research, there's been more focus on what are the benefits that steroids can give you. And Pete gave me some good quotes about, actually, because of the way things trend on social media, nobody wants to show the downsides. Nobody's going to say about the negatives. They're just going to highlight the positives of how they look and show things off. So when it comes to steroids, nobody's necessarily talking about the bad things that happen to them. So Mark, who was a personal trainer, talked about one of his friends who had been a trainer at the same gym, and he says he took it for a couple of months, got great results, got big, got shredded, got what he wanted, probably got in the best shape of his life. Then he stopped taking it, that was where it all went wrong for him. A couple of months later, he lost his job, struggled to hold a conversation with people, massively struggled to pay his bills and stuff, on anxiety and depression tablets, and yeah, there was nothing wrong with him before he started taking them. And there were a few responses in the work of people. It's a well-known effect of steroids that actually, if you come off them without following proper protocols, because you suppress your natural testosterone when you go on steroids, if you don't then take the correct drugs to restart that testosterone and to manage the increase in estrogen that comes with adding exogenous testosterone, it can lead to very severe depression. And it's interesting that I had a few responses, and this was probably the most stark just because it was a personal trainer in the gym, but actually harm caused by the cessation of use of steroids. And this ties in with that short-term thinking that actually we're seeing more of now, whereas the powerlifters historically were planning for very long-term because they wanted to be competitive in a few years. Actually, with more of the pressures of social media, now it is more about that quick fix, and people perhaps aren't as conscious of these issues to do with, if I come off, how do I do that appropriately? So that's just a sample of some of the harms, but you can see how obviously these kinds of harms can potentially be quite severe and can be tied in with sort of conceptions of masculinity within these gym-going subcultures. Now, building on this, it wasn't just steroid-related harms that I saw. There were also harms to do with the use of other drugs, and these tied in with the use of steroids very often, or tied in with sort of subcultural norms and behaviours within these subcultures. So an interesting one to build on, to kind of show again how these conceptions of masculinity and these ideals inform other drug use, is actually comparing powerlifters' polydrug use with that associated with the lads. So powerlifters, when they were justifying using drugs other than steroids, it was very much couched in terms of this is beneficial for performance purposes. So they would discuss using diazepam, Valium, and talk about how that was being used to offset the negative side effects of steroids. So they were taking steroids to help their training so that they could get bigger and stronger and be more competitive. But at the same time, if the steroids gave them insomnia and they couldn't sleep, or it gave them mood swings, this would actually harm their training. So then they started taking diazepam on top of the steroids to deal with those side effects, to help them get a good night's sleep and so forth. And I think an interesting harm which you can explore in the context of this is, if you're taking steroids on a 20-week cycle and you're using diazepam the entire time to offset any potential side effects, that's easily using long enough that you start to get into that territory of worrying about dependency and so forth. And also, these are often black market drugs, not necessarily diverted prescriptions, which the opiates that I'll mention next tend to be. There's also potential for sort of, are they necessarily what they claim to be? Because we've seen recent reports, recent cases where novel benzos have been found in what's claimed to be Valium or Xanax. So potentially some harms in there linked to the steroid use itself, but not actually being the result of steroids. And similarly, the use of opiates to train through injury pain. These guys being very focused on wanting to be the strongest, wanting to be the best, would want to keep training in the gym even when they were injured. And sometimes they would use steroids that were felt to help you to repair faster, or help to offset some of the problems with injuries, felt to lubricate joints, things like that. And sometimes they would just take opiate pills, whether that was codeine or right the way up to morphine sulfate, to help them, grit their way through injury. And you can very much contextualize that with ideas of masculinity and this idea of, I'm going to man up and get through this. But what potential harms are coming from that, both to continuing to train whilst you're injured, obviously, what kind of physical damage can that do to you, but also the kind of normalization of using opiates. Perhaps also there's some potential harm in there, given we know the harms associated with the use of these drugs. So long-term focus on physical capabilities, it didn't mean powerlifters weren't using drugs, but it meant that the drugs were still very much focused. What was determined to be acceptable use among them was based on these ideals. And this can be contrast with some of the other groups who their use was more about living this kind of hedonic lifestyle that ties in with the social media posting and the going to the club and getting your shirt off and things like that. So more focus on kind of the use of cocaine and alcohol in these other subcultures, which is not to say powerlifters never used alcohol, but it's just in terms of examining prevalence, it was very interesting to see that the lads far more focused on, we use coke and we use MDMA and we drink, and the powerlifters, you get some of these narratives against that because they're felt to be bringing the sport into disrepute almost by giving this impression that steroids are more dangerous if you're using other drugs alongside them. So Mariusz critiqued these drug abusers as they kind of framed them by saying, I know some people are on steroids, they go out and they get drunk and they do fucking coke. You're just asking for a heart attack, basically. So he was very negative actually about those types of people because, that's not a good look for steroid users. He wants to say, I'm a safe steroid user. I use them in a way that's not going to cause a lot of damage. And it's these people over here. They're the ones who are hurting themselves by engaging in these other behaviors and not knowing you shouldn't be doing coke or getting drunk when you're on steroids. And Jim, who was another powerlifter, he kind of compared it to, he used the context of roid rage, actually, that people talk about roid rage, which he said was a myth. And he says, in my opinion, it stems from people taking steroids, going out on a Friday night and doing coke, getting into fights. Then it always seems to come back to the steroids rather than other things they've taken. So this belief, and a lot of powerlifters highlighted this, that actually if you're not an aggressive person and you're not engaging in these types of behaviors normally, if you're on steroids, you're not necessarily going to have roid rage, have anger issues. It's more to do with the type of people who want to take steroids to look big and pose in front of people and get into arguments and things. That type of personality type is also likely to be using steroids, and if they're also getting drunk or taking other drugs, then that can lead to these rage issues that then gets pinned on what Jim or Mariusz would term honest steroid users, guys who are using it purely for gym purposes. So some quite interesting discussions there around actually what is appropriate behavior and the subcultural framing of what is appropriate drug use and what is kind of bringing us into disrepute. Now, as I said, Pete talked about a friend who had a heart attack on a night out. And it's interesting that sort of lads I spoke to, Pete and another guy, Carl, and they and people who were kind of more on the fringes of those scenes as well. But they were talking about actually how they were doing these drugs on nights out and using those on top of the use of steroids and on top of fat burners and things. So you can kind of think about actually that probably stacking cocaine or MDMA or whatever on top of the use of drugs that are known to sort of have effects on your heart rate and blood pressure and all sorts of things. Potentially there's a lot of harm in there. So Pete, that friend, and then he had others who had heart conditions who were still using steroids. So quite some interesting things in there. And of course, the use of ephedrine, caffeine and aspirin as a fat burning stack. That's another obvious one where people are just taking these various stimulants and putting them on top, and of course what are the potential harms there. And Robert, who was a guy I spoke to, he worked as a physiotherapist, and he was talking about some of these cases of like guys from the gym who had died in their 20s, and he was saying it's a bit odd seeing the memorial pages and being like, oh, RIP, for this guy from the gym. He was like thinking, what are the odds that there's been this group of guys in their 20s who apparently have just all had underlying heart conditions and died very young? Isn't it, is it more to do with the use of steroids and then taking cocaine and things on nights out, which he knows they were involved in? So again, there's not necessarily, I don't have hard evidence on that, but that's just something that somebody raised in the course of the research. Is that's the impression he gets, is actually this is causing actual sort of observable harms. So again, the lads and the kind of aesthetics guys, because they have this ideal of masculinity where it is about going and partying and showing off, perhaps engage more in that kind of drug use, whereas the powerlifters' drug use was more about what can I take that's going to facilitate my training and allow me to train more. So interesting intersections of ideals of masculinity with actual drug use and harms. Now, building on this, another harm that ties in with this kind of aesthetics culture, and again, this is Pete talking about one of his friends. I was amazed at the number of friends he's had with negative health conditions. I think he mentions about 4 of them in the course of our interview. 3 heart conditions plus this one. So some interesting things going on in that friendship group. But yeah, he was talking about this friend who's very social media conscious. Everything he does for likes on social media. He's always taking pictures of his shirt off. And he said, Mike had this mark on his skin, 12 millimeters. He's had it for 6 months. So he's gone to a doctor. They've panicked and said, right, you need to get yourself to the hospital. He's got an appointment. And then Pete says, but this is the sort of mindset of these lads. He said, right, well, I better inject as much Melanotan as I can, which is a tanning drug, makes your skin look darker, before I go to the doctors. I'm going to the sunbeds tomorrow. Like, if I'm going to the hospital, I want to look tanned. So because he didn't know how long he was going to be in hospital, he didn't know if he was going to lose his tan, he's going to inject himself with a synthetic tanning drug and use the sunbed, just to make sure that if he does wind up in the hospital for a couple of weeks, he's still going to look tanned when he gets out. So I've sort of said that the level to which there's this obsession with looking a certain way among some of these men, it does seem to be a disorder almost. And can we link it to, trends in anorexia when we look at the work on pro-ana forums and young women's participation in these kind of anorexia forums? Is this fitness posting for some men like Mike, is it having a similar impact? Because there's no way that should be a normal response to being worried you have skin cancer. And yet Pete doesn't go, I was so worried about him because this is such a crazy thing. He goes, this is the sort of mindset of these lads. Like, yeah, that's a bit crazy, but so yeah, an interesting finding. This being said, I don't want to give the impression that it's only the new aesthetics culture where you see harm and that you don't see the powerlifters engaging in behavior that's clearly harmful, clearly risky, that they should know better about. So an incident which really highlights this, the powerlifters were much better informed about using steroids and they knew the proper procedures for coming off. But nonetheless, I think this case really highlights where harms could occur. So Rich, who was a powerlifter, says, after he had been using steroids, a few weeks after, my balls started to come back because obviously they shrink when you're taking steroids. That's a well-known side effect. And then they come back a bit later. The left one was much bigger than the right one. I think he said it was like twice the size. Yeah, that's later in the quote. So he says, that's to the point where I was legitimately worried, looking for medical advice online. I was on these forums saying, look, one of my testicles is twice the size of the other. What should I do? Because I didn't want to go to the doctor and tell him I was messing with steroids, have that on my medical records permanently. I was legitimately more worried it might be cancer or something. So that was a bit scary. So testicular cancer is an extremely aggressive cancer. And rather than go to a doctor, as soon as he was concerned, he's looking around on forums trying to find, what's another explanation, and asking people on forums for advice. So potentially, is it relevant that this is a great comment there. So this was a bit scary, bit of an understatement. Yeah. Well, what's weird is that his reaction doesn't necessarily show that's an understatement, because if he was legitimately panicked, you would have expected him to go to a doctor. So that's what makes this really interesting, is that it's very surprising. You could think you have what is well known to be a very aggressive form of cancer and just be like, I was a bit worried, so I went on some forums, and luckily it went away after a week or two. So I've sort of highlighted, is it relevant that this is kind of like a male problem? When we see things about men are worried to talk about erectile dysfunction and things because they think it makes them less manly, is it relevant that this is to do with his balls, and he's thinking, if I lose one, I'm not going to be a man anymore? I think there's probably something in there that we could tease apart to explain why this powerlifter, who's very informed, knows a lot about steroids, is so scared to kind of go to a doctor. Yeah, so he had previously been competitive as a natural powerlifter, but then he went into an untested federation. So I don't think it was that at this stage. But I think it is relevant to think about the context of my work, because I did this work in Devon, and a lot of the guys who were training in gyms, when you would ask them about their plans for the future, they were saying, "Oh, there's no good jobs. I'm going to try and join the military." So I think it's possible that there was an effect of the locale here, whereby Rich was conscious that he might want to join the military and didn't want to have that he used steroids on his medical records for that. So there's potentially a couple of factors which could have influenced this, but I think it's nonetheless interesting to consider that framing. And of course, in either of those cases, I think it ties in with military. So building on this idea of some broader harms and kind of harms that are more generic across training cultures, an area perhaps a bit apart from the effects of influence of masculinity beyond that it encourages them to use steroids in the first place, is this idea of product cleanliness. And not necessarily everybody knows this. The sort of hardcore lifters do, they're well familiar, but a lot of steroids are actually manufactured locally, even if they appear to be manufactured in high quality labs. So they'll come in boxes and have stickers on that make it look as though they've been professionally made, and actually the reality is that they're imported in powder form from China, and then some guy in England is mixing them with oils and alcohol and heating them to make the finished injectable vials. So there is the potential there for some uncleanly product or poor strength product or issues with sterility in product coming out of that. So there's potentially these harms coming from the quality of product in the area that not everybody who is involved in steroids, particularly if you're getting supplied steroids from a friend and it looks like it's in a pharmaceutical quality vial, you might think it's safe to inject and not realize that actually some of this product might not necessarily be all that sterile. So this is a harm that actually a powerlifter experienced. So again, most of the powerlifters were aware of the correct protocols and knew what doses they should be using steroids in and knew about taking PCT and things. But this one thought he had a decent product, and he says, "I injected it into my glute. I got cellulitis, which is an infection under the skin. I got this red lump, solid and hot. Went to the doctor on the third day because it had spread like halfway down my leg." And talking about the fact that you can get product, buy it, and it can have that kind of effect, he says that could just be made in someone's kitchen with his cat walking around for all I know, licking the bowl. That's dodgy shit. So this awareness that actually some of these harms go beyond behaving in a manner that neglects risk and taking too many drugs and so forth, but it can also just be being involved in the use of steroids inherently comes with some risks of harm. So moving on, an interesting topic that's come up in recent research. Actually, John Hoberman published on this initially in 2006, but it's since become a trend again based on a lot of the online posting, a lot of the forum posting, and now it's becoming a really popular topic. So it's something that researchers have again refocused on, which is this idea of testosterone replacement therapy. So it's men who are saying, I'm using testosterone so that I feel better day to day, so that I feel more alive, so I have more focus, and actually rationalizing it beyond the gym and beyond necessarily just their looks, and talking about just day to day, it makes me feel more alive. So Underwood et al. Compare this to people who microdose with psychedelics for optimization, and it allows them to be more creative and work better. And the argument is that now there's a trend towards testosterone being used for these purposes. And, people like Joe Rogan talking about it on the podcast, talking about how good testosterone replacement therapy is, and having millions of subscribers who listen to that. Is it therefore going to become prevalent that people are going to see this as a normal thing? So Hoberman actually talks about this in the interesting way in which, you can tie it back to that historic use of desire to take these hormones to rejuvenate, and this idea that you can take this synthetic male hormone and it makes you more manly and more capable. So there's definitely some interesting aspects of masculinity that you could tease apart in relation to this desire to take testosterone for your day-to-day living, so that you can feel more alive, feel more of a man, and so forth. So it's interesting that there's been this rise in discourse around men worried that they're deficient in testosterone. Do I need to take TRT because of my testosterone levels? Now, again, if men are worried that they aren't as strong as their fathers or whatever, is that because of transitions in, now we're a lot more sedentary than we were, changes in work environment, changes in diet, and so forth? Whereas the way in which this comes across, if you read any of these forum posts, if you're exposed to this, is all very much, this is an issue that needs to be fixed through medication, as opposed to lifestyle and diet changes and so forth. On the other hand, I think it is important when we're talking about TRT to look at some of these narratives where people have talked about their use and the value that it's had. So I spoke to one guy, Dean, who he swore by it, and he said testosterone had saved his life, and he rationalized it, and he was explaining in quite a lot of depth actually what had underpinned his use. So he said, anabolic steroids aren't just for athletes and bodybuilders. Myself, I started on this path because I had all the symptoms of low test. I had no energy, brain fog, depression. It was horrible. I lived like that for 10 years. At breaking point, I was suicidal because I had no drive. I couldn't focus at work. I was unable to remember anything past a 5-minute conversation. I had a friend that introduced me to steroids. Now I feel drastically better with no desire to take my own life, thanks to getting my energy back and being able to enjoy my life again. This stuff saves lives. So he was very adamant that actually low testosterone is a real thing. It is a real problem. And because most doctors will just tell you to take antidepressants if you say you have severe depression, he was saying this is why guys have to turn to buying steroids online, using these illicit steroids, because it's the only way that they can get the treatment they need. So potentially there is a kind of overdiagnosis because it's become a popular trend. It's been talked about by these figures. You see adverts for it online. There's probably a lot of men who think they need testosterone who don't at all. But potentially there are guys like Dean who actually it can be life-changing. So it's very interesting to kind of look at that interplay between what is actually countering harms and allowing people to live better lives versus what is based on a desire to live a better life but actually could be harmful, which you can compare more to sort of the use of stimulants. People they divert stimulants from prescriptions and use them every day to try and give them an edge at work and things like that. So it's interesting to kind of note that dynamic in relation to this use of testosterone and where it can be for health optimization and where it might actually be addressing medical conditions when used off-label, versus whether it is just this pursuit of an idea of, oh, I'm a real man and I should be able to work much harder and therefore I should be taking this. So interesting to kind of consider in that context, I think. Also, I've noted on the slide at the bottom, there's also the element of drug use to avoid social harms too. And this idea of fitting in an identity in steroid use, I think, is quite interesting to explore and quite important. So comparing, I mentioned there was a decline in traditional jobs requiring masculine labor, traditional industry jobs, and there's been much more of a rise in service sector jobs, and perhaps men have lost that way of gaining masculine identity and capital that they had historically. If you historically went and worked in a pottery, or you went and worked in a mine, or you went and worked in steel manufacture, those were places where men would go, where they would build friendships around shared activity and toil, and this was part of both their masculine identity formation and kind of how they made their friends, met their friends. So what's interesting when we talk about these ideas of, we look at post-industrial masculinities, we look at concerns over male suicides and feelings from men that they've been left behind, it's interesting to contextualize the gym as actually a space for masculine friendships and identity formation. So I've got this quote from Rich on the slide where he says, honestly, all my friends around here are from the gym. And there were quite a few guys who would say, the gym is where I come, it's my space, this is where all my friends are, this is where I know what I'm doing, this is where I can get away from problems in my life. So when we're talking about harms, to what extent can we think of the gym as therapeutic for men who maybe don't have those other outlets? And particularly when we're concerned about male suicide and so on, I think that's quite important to kind of look at and contextualize. So this paper I've linked at the bottom, this is forthcoming, not published yet, but we've looked at sort of these ideas of actually, with the lack of traditional roots to masculine capital, where does the gym become a site for bodily graft for men, and also for their craft and their performance and feeling as though they're gaining value from actually being able to come in and craft these bodies and become experts and gain some kind of status, as well as the kind of framing of friendship around it. So I think a very important thing to keep in mind when we're talking about gym cultures and steroids. Brandon's put in the chat, this really alludes to Learning to Labour by Willis. Men in the gym show their graft in these open spaces instead of more traditional. Yeah, I think that's a brilliant insight, Brandon. Absolutely ties in there. So moving on from this, there's, we can actually see this. We see this in forum posts and in gym memes and things, and they are, they're semi-facetious, but really it does hint at an underlying reality. There's this post, the most ignored form of therapy, the barbell, and a lot of guys do talk about the gym as therapy. So coming back to Pete talking about his friends, he was saying he's got one and he knows he lifts a lot for stress relief, letting out anger. That's his release. That's how he lets go, just by lifting weights, lifting big, sort of punishing himself, really, pushing and grinding. So this was a friend Pete said had a lot of problems in his personal life, issues, and he would just come to the gym, and that was how he kind of gained his therapy. That's how he got through it, was he would push himself, just really grind, and that would make him feel better. And there were plenty of guys in my research who said similar things. And of course, in the online portions, finding images like this, people clearly do identify with this. Actually, the idea of the gym, it's a protective environment for men, and also it's seen as like therapeutic and escape for them. And building on that is that aspect of identity formation, is actually those men who feel left behind, they feel they don't have a real masculine identity. It at least gives them some feeling of belonging. So Carl was I spoke to, he was one of the lads, and I had this deep conversation with him where he talked about just feeling hopeless, feeling he had no future, and feeling suicidal, and sort of confiding all that in me, because I think because he couldn't say it to his friends, or felt he couldn't. The other lads he went out with, ironically, he was friends with Pete, who actually said some quite similar things to me. And I think there is this framing of, we don't feel we can talk about this sort of thing, so they latch on to this ideal of masculinity. This is their way to express themselves and not have to worry about those feelings of not having a future, not having a place. Because what do? I go to the gym with my friends, and I work on myself. So actually, there was an article in the Sun talking about, when I did my BBC interview, talking about harassment in the gyms, and I made a point of, for some young men, they are latching onto these cultures as kind of identity formation, and that does inform why you get some of this kind of laddish behavior in gyms. And this article in the Sun was like really critical, saying, I don't think at all it's about insecurity and identity. I think it's about and she was quite insulting. She referred to me as Dr. Luke rather than Dr. Turnock, things like that. But I think when you actually get down and you talk to these guys and you talk to these lads, you do realize that there are these real insecurities, masculine insecurities, that participating in these gym cultures and behaving in these ways actually is in some way therapeutic for them, even if it comes with potentially negative or toxic behaviors that you might want to address separately. Speaking of which, that ties in quite well with my next slide, this idea of men's spaces. So we might think of these men as seeing this as, this is their space now, this is like the replacement of the working man's club or whatever. So it's interesting with growing commercialism and actually the changing of gym spaces as they're becoming more commercial and they're appealing more to this online posting and so forth. And a part of that, of course, is a lot more women participating in gym culture. What kind of rhetoric do we see, or what kind of opinions do we see from those old school lifters? So I have here Rex, who's a lifter in his 40s, complaining because he's talking about this influx of women who come in, they leave an hour looking as good as they came in after pretending to work out. So they're just there to look good, post it on social media. They're not serious about training. And Elsa, one of the younger personal trainers there, she said, "Oh, what a surprise, Rex is being opinionated again. Who cares what people do when they're here? Who are you to judge them? The problem with you is you won't accept things have changed, and the gym is as much a social thing these days." And Rex says, "Exactly. Before, the gym was the Iron Church, and people came here to train, and there was a social aspect, but it's centered around training." So very much of that opinion that the gym is this space for hard work, for hard graft, and our socializing is based around that. So tying into those ideas of traditional masculinity. So Elsa comments, "Well, times have changed and it's not that way anymore. You just have to learn to accept that." And Rex's response is interesting, saying, "I don't see why I have to accept change being imposed on me. Why do I have to accept a change I don't think is reasonable?" So very much he feels as though he's losing his space. He feels as though he's losing the place where he felt secure, that felt protective. And when we're talking about these kind of concerns over masculinity and loss of masculine identity, he feels as though he's losing his place in the world. So I think that's quite interesting, that actually, if we're worried about these left behind men, isn't it interesting to kind of examine it in the case of with the commercial changes and broader cultural changes, try and understand them. Brandon's just put in chat, it's like the protection of the turf. Definitely, yeah. It's like this is my culture. This is how I think people should behave in here, and I don't like the changes. So I want to make sure I keep hold of what I valued. So yeah, very interesting rhetoric. Now, with this being said, this isn't a call to say, oh, we should just accept that there are these men's spaces and that they must stay this way, because of course a lot of the research that's talked about masculinities and these kind of insecurities and fears has actually linked it to these kind of outdated conceptions of masculinity and said those men who are better able to adapt their masculinities to more reflect contemporary values and culture actually are the ones who seem to have fewer of these concerns. And Grayson Perry did a brilliant episode of his TV show on this, where he was talking to MMA fighters from one of these post-industrial towns and sort of talking about how the traditional working man's masculinity actually led to this culture where there was this silence and men didn't feel they could reach out for help, and how that kind of exacerbated harms and led to, in one of the cases, the suicide of a guy who Grayson interviews his friends. So if you haven't watched that, that's definitely worth watching. So perhaps there is some scope when we're talking about this and we're talking about gym cultures and harm. Steroids perhaps is something that we really should focus on at the forefront, but let's not leave out what can we do to kind of help men to navigate these broader changes where the gym might be seen as their kind of respite from them, and the gym is where they go to kind of get away from these things that they're more concerned about. Is there a way that we can help men who are using the gym for those purposes and help them with their understanding of masculinity? So I think that's all very important to understand, and naturally really does intersect with harms. So that is the end of my actual research presentation portion of this lecture. So were there any questions or comments or anything before we move on? Yeah, there's one of the very funny things is always in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, you always call out the big bodybuilder to roll the second in sparring because you'll absolutely destroy him because he'll be completely gassed out after the first 5 minutes, right? So it is interesting those contrasting conceptions of masculinity, where in one realm it's very much based on strength and having that body capital, being able to show off, and in the other it's much more based on that technical ability and ability to evidence technique, that I can handle this person, I don't even need to put any strength into it. And it's those different ways in which we evidence masculine competencies. So ultimately, we're striving for the same thing. It's masculine competency, but it's being expressed in very different ways. And for the lads, it's probably if I can get all the girls' attention and get all the likes on social media, then I've evidenced it. I know there's been a few writers who have talked about this. Linda Johnston talked about female bodybuilders and sort of challenging traditional conceptions of femininity. And I know Tanya Bunsell has done this as well and sort of explored the way in which they're kind of treading this line almost of going outside of acceptable gender norms, becoming more, associated with masculine, and therefore, the navigation of this. But simultaneously, when we're talking about this trend in fitness online culture that we see today, you see the big roided up guys on like the Gymshark Instagram and thing. And what do you see about the girls? They've all got the big butt and they're all made up basically to look like Barbie, right? So it's interesting that really stark contrast between in the competitive subcultures where it's the women are considered way outside the norms of femininity, whereas when we see it in these popular online posts, they're going way more into stereotypical gender roles. So I think that's a really interesting area to tease apart. And then, as you said, yeah, the way that things are represented on TV, and we have this. It's almost like a kind of biological positivism, isn't it? It's people who look a certain way often get attributed with certain personality types. I think there's a lot of that stuff goes on in media. Into techniques of neutralisation. I mean, there's the extent to which it can be applied to that rationale around health, right? So I mentioned it in relation to TRT, how a lot of guys might be wanting to make it seem as though they're primarily interested in their health, medicalizing it, when in fact it's more for a kind of performance optimization perspective. And you can see that more broadly in language around steroids, how people kind of rationalize why they're using them and the benefits of them. So I think in terms of techniques of neutralization, that would be the main area where I saw that really come through. Yeah, I mean, there's been some really interesting pieces on gym space explicitly and kind of the gendered nature of those spaces, and I was trying to marry that up with more of that kind of social geographic literature about men in these left behind communities. So I was taking some of that rural studies literature where it does make that the focus. And oh, actually, an interesting thinker that marries these both, Steph Cohen at Nottingham. She, when she was based in Canada, had written a piece on rural masculinities and this idea of these left behind men, kind of outdated conceptions of masculinity. And then her more recent research, she's been looking at gender in the gym from like a women's perspective of using the gym. So in some ways, if you read her work, you get a feeling for both those elements that I've tried to bring together in my piece. But yeah, that's something that has been articulated in my work. More so my work when I've been talking with women, but it could be that the men have just been they don't want to admit to feeling intimidated, perhaps. But when I've interviewed women about their experiences of the gym, they've talked about some of the issues with the use of space and these kind of zones of transition and how that can be quite intimidating, and some of the messaging that goes along with gyms. So it's interesting to see that you guys are all picking up on those aspects of space and those kind of intersections, with space and place and how we feel in relation to places, and also, of course, how those tie in with gender. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So I'll put those names. So Steph Cohen is the one who's currently writing on that. Well, has written recently on that. So her work is very interesting. Um, so I would recommend, if you're interested in these kind of gendered spaces of the gym, her work is definitely worth investigating. And then here's a video that I did on it. Hopefully that is the video link and not just to my channel. But if it is just to my channel, you'll be able to see it. It's called The Gendered Space of the Gym. And that's quite interesting. That one was about my work talking to women about their experiences of the gym and just highlighting some of those issues with the gym being structured as a stage and having these very intimidating aspects to it. So if that is kind of a subtopic people are interested in, please check both of those out. Yeah, there is a certain degree of that, isn't there? Of first, it's the personal kind of confidence and building that, and then there's also that kind of when are you accepted? There was an interesting comment in my research from a woman who was a very competent lifter, but she was saying about how you get to a certain point where she felt as a woman, despite being competent, she still wasn't fully accepted by the guys. And she said the phrase was, "There's a difference between tolerance and acceptance," and I quite like that. Like you can reach a point where you're tolerated in all the areas of the gym, but you don't necessarily feel accepted. So it's hard to estimate the actual percentages, basically because all the research that's been done where it's just things like the British Crime Survey where it asks seems to massively underrepresent versus what we get from the qualitative data when we go into gyms. So you saw that in that article I highlighted from Carl Mulrooney and Katinka van der Ven, where actually they're saying the prevalence seems to be a lot higher when you go into gyms and you talk to people and you find out who's using, who has friends who are using, versus what we get from official data. So the official data has it at a quite low percentage, I think. But certainly, if you get within these fitness cultures, which are increasingly popular, it does seem to be very prevalent. Yeah. I mean, the two guys that I cited, Pete and Carl, they were both 23. And a lot of the powerlifters were in their 20s as well, and they started using. So I did hear discussions like Mark, the personal trainer, he said a lot of the guys who were like 18, 19, they're all talking about it. A lot of them are doing it. But certainly in terms of my personal experience, guys I know, it has been guys who are in their sort of early to mid 20s when they start getting on it. So again, it's hard to say specifically because I have spoken to personal trainers who probably do know what they're talking about, who say 18, 19-year-olds. But yeah, just from my observation, the people who I've spoken to, it was mostly, as you've said, sort of early to mid 20s. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, definitely. I mean, in some of those comments, not even necessarily going for the guys who are in GBPF or whatever, but going like I know one of the guys was saying about he made sure he was like, I'm not taking any steroids until I can deadlift at least 4 plates because that's something I should easily be able to hit naturally. So he made sure that he waited until he did that so that he knew he had got his form down, so that he knew he had the appropriate base. Whereas talking to Josh, who was kind of training with his mates when he was 19, and he was talking about, oh, I started training, and about 3 weeks later, I noticed all the other guys were getting much bigger than me, and I said, "What's going on?" He said, "Oh yeah, take these Dynabol." So it does definitely seem to be like really culturally or subculturally contextualized, whether there's an expectation you invest a certain amount of time, reach a certain level, as we tended to see from the powerlifters, or whether it's just we're all mates, we're all training, we've all got these goals, therefore we're just going to supply each other with steroids. So yeah, definitely, I saw that in my work. I mean, I had a friend who basically said the same thing. He said, yeah, if I could just get it from the NHS and I knew it was good, good quality, and I knew I could, get my blood work done, I would 100% go on it. So I think there is rising rhetoric around that. But as you say, to what extent is this people who are actually concerned of low testosterone versus to what extent is this an idea of, oh, this will optimize my performance and I'll be able to do this much more at work and these kind of things. In which case, can we link it to students who are taking, Adderall to be able to cram in more before their exams and things like that? It's kind of interesting to think about those comparisons we can make to other drug use. Yeah, so I think that's actually a really interesting way of contextualizing it, as you say, those kind of elements. First of all, the idea, if the idea is graft and you're working hard and you're evidencing that, if you're taking something to kind of speed that along and get it a quick way, is that almost cheating? Is that almost a shortcut? And how do they rationalize that? And especially with those kind of fake natties, the guys who say that they're natural when they are using steroids, I think that does kind of indicate some insecurity, doesn't it? Because they're not willing to admit to it. Like a lot of the guys I was speaking to would happily admit they were on steroids, the powerlifters. But I know there are some people who absolutely swear they've never touched steroids when they clearly are using them. One of the old trainers at my gym down here, well, one of the gyms down here, this was hilarious. He swore he never used steroids, but you could see his face blowing up and shrinking down with the water retention when he was on steroids. So I would walk in and he'd have a really fat face, and I'd be like, "Oh, he's on cycle now." So it's just funny that he refused to admit it when it was that obvious to anyone who knew what they were looking for. And as you said as well, the social comparison to other men and the way that they're kind of clearly unhappy with their physique and basing it around these kind of social comparisons goes against sort of orthodox ideals of masculinity, definitely. All right, well, thanks for all the comments and feedback, everybody. I'm really glad that you sort of found something in this that interested you and that you could kind of identify with and pick apart. So really happy with sort of the discussion there. Clearly you took quite a lot from it.